Hey guys, tonight we step into the Ottoman Empire, a world of sultans, harems, janissaries and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and immediately you're disappointed. No marble halls, no golden domes, no silk curtains. Instead, you're lying on a straw mat in a drafty room that smells like damp wool and goat. If you're a peasant, which statistically you are, your palace consists of 4 mud walls, a smoke-stained ceiling, and livestock that act like they pay rent. The family goat is chewing on your only shirt. You sigh. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire. But maybe you think, I'll aim higher. I'll be a janissary. Congratulations. You're still miserable. As a janissary, you weren't even allowed to stay with your family. You were taken from them as a child through the Devshirme system, converted, trained, and moulded into one of the Sultan's elite soldiers. Sounds prestigious, right? Until you realize you were basically kidnapped for the privilege of becoming state property. Your bed may be cleaner than a peasant's, but your alarm clock is a drill sergeant shouting at you in Turkish. And if you were born noble, don't get comfortable. Nobility in the Ottoman Empire was less cozy aristocracy and more walking target. At any moment, the Sultan could decide you looked suspicious, and suddenly your life expectancy drops to 0. The richer your clothes, the shorter your leash. Sleep lightly. Silk bowstrings were made for more than tying packages. The point is, no matter where you start, you're waking up in someone else's palace. The Sultan owns the land, the soldiers, and effectively you. You don't wake up to think, what do I want to do today? You wake up to think, how do I avoid dying today? Breakfast? Maybe. Bread if you're lucky, but don't expect variety. Comfort? Only if you enjoy flea bites. Privacy? Forget it. Ottoman society wasn't designed for your convenience. It was designed for the state's stability, which means your personal happiness ranks somewhere below sharpening spears. So, there you are, first thing in the morning, hungry, itchy, and already nervous about the Sultan's mood. And you've only been awake for 10 minutes. Survive this long enough, and maybe you'll live to see lunch. Though, don't get your hopes up. You stumble out of bed, stomach growling, ready for breakfast, and by ready, I mean already disappointed. Forget eggs, cheese, or anything warm. In the Ottoman Empire, breakfast isn't a meal, it's a test of your will to live. If you're a peasant, congratulations. You get bread. Hard, dry bread. Bread that doubles as a weapon if you throw it hard enough. You might soften it in water, or dip it in olive oil if you're lucky. But most mornings it's just you, your jaw, and the challenge of not breaking your teeth before noon. Occasionally, someone brings out cheese or yogurt, but don't count on it. That's feast day material, not your average Tuesday. If you're in the city, you might catch the smell of something better. Flatbreads baking in clay ovens, sesame seeds sprinkled on top, maybe a few olives sold in the marketplace. You'll get hungry just walking by, but unless you have coins jingling in your purse, keep dreaming. Because food markets in Istanbul were a paradise for the wealthy and a torture chamber for everyone else. Of course, if you're one of the lucky few serving in the palace kitchens, you'll actually see abundance. Honey, butter, fruits, even meat. But you won't eat it. That's for the Sultan and his court. You'll be carrying trays and wiping sweat, your nose filled with the smell of roasting lamb while you chew on, yes, more bread. And then there's coffee. Oh, glorious coffee. The Ottomans were among the first to truly embrace it, turning it into a social obsession. Strong, bitter, black coffee poured into tiny cups. The smell alone could wake the dead. But here's the catch. Coffee wasn't always safe. Religious authorities occasionally banned it, calling it a sinful stimulant. Imagine risking prison because you needed a caffeine boost before work. One wrong sip, and suddenly your morning latte is heresy. So your choices for breakfast are stale bread, a handful of olives if fortune smiles, or risking eternal damnation for coffee. You wolf down the bread, tell yourself it's rustic, and pretend your stomach isn't already planning its rebellion. By the time you're done, you're not satisfied. You're just alive. And in the Ottoman Empire, that's the best review breakfast ever got. You've barely finished choking down your bread when there's a knock at the door. It's not a neighbour. It's not a friend. It's the Ottoman tax collector, the medieval version of a debt collector, except scarier and with the full weight of the empire behind him. Taxes in the Ottoman Empire were like the weather, unavoidable and rarely pleasant. You pay for your land, your crops, your animals. If you're Christian or Jewish, you also pay the jizya, a special congratulations for not being Muslim tax. It's basically a bill for existing. And if you're Muslim, congratulations again. You still owe taxes on your grain, your goats, and possibly the dust in your house. Nobody escapes. The collector arrives with an entourage, a scribe with a big book, maybe a guard or two with sharp swords, and an expression that says, "I will absolutely take your chickens." You hand over a sack of grain, praying it's enough. It isn't. It's never enough. The scribe writes down your name, mutters something about arrears, and the guard eyes your boots like they'd fit him better. Try to argue and see what happens. You say, "But the harvest was bad this year." The collector says, "Not my problem." You say, "My children are starving." He says, "Then they'll eat less." You say, "I have nothing left." He smiles and takes the goat. That goat was the only reason you had milk. Now you have nothing but a grudge and lactose deficiency. If you're really unlucky, the collector decides you're lying. Out come the beatings. Ottoman tax law had a wonderfully efficient system of encouragement. Hit the peasant until the money appears. Spoiler, it doesn't, but the bruises do. City dwellers had it no easier. If you ran a shop in Istanbul, inspectors could show up unannounced, check your scales, accuse you of cheating, and fine you on the spot. Too poor to pay? They'd confiscate your goods. Too stubborn to cooperate? Straight to jail. Congratulations, your humble spice stall just became state property. By the time the tax collector leaves, you're broke, barefoot and hungry again. You look at your family and smile weakly, as if to say, well, at least they didn't take the roof. The roof leaks, but hey, small victories. It's not even noon yet, and the Ottoman Empire has already reminded you who's boss. Spoiler, it isn't you. You've survived breakfast and the tax collector, but now comes the next joy of Ottoman life. Religion as a billable service. The empire was proudly Islamic, but also ruled over millions of Christians and Jews. On paper, this meant toleration. In practice, it meant tolerated, but pay up. If you weren't Muslim, you got the privilege of paying the jizya, a special tax politely labelled as protection money. Protection from what? From the empire itself, of course. It's the medieval version of the mafia. Nice house you've got here. Shame if someone confiscated it. You line up at the collector's table with your fellow villagers. The Muslims shuffle past with grumbling, their taxes are bad enough. But when your turn comes, you get the extra bill. You fork over coins you don't have, smiling weakly while muttering prayers that the scribe doesn't accidentally write down a higher amount than you actually owe. Spoiler, he does. Some neighbours whisper about conversion. After all, if you embrace Islam, you dodge the jizya. But it's not a free pass. You'll still owe grain taxes, field taxes, and probably some random levy invented last Tuesday, because the Sultan's palace needs a new fountain. Changing religions doesn't change the fact that you live in a system where your wallet is always empty and your overlord is always thirsty. Of course, religion wasn't just about taxes. It was about status. Muslims had the privileges, better legal standing, access to higher offices, the ability to testify in court without being ignored. You, as a Christian or Jew, you're technically part of the dhimmi community, protected people. Protected in the same way a landlord protects his property. Useful, but disposable. And let's not forget the cultural tension. Your festivals, your churches, your traditions, they're allowed, but under watchful eyes. The wrong sermon, the wrong crowd gathering, and suddenly the guards are asking questions. Nothing ruins Easter like an Ottoman soldier standing at the back of the church, hand on his sword. So, what do? You keep your head down, pay your tax, and hope nobody reports you for blasphemy over a careless word. In a world where faith and finance were fused, survival meant walking a tightrope between belief and bankruptcy. And remember, it's not even midday yet. It's just after midday, and word spreads through the bazaar. The Sultan sneezed. You laugh, until you notice everyone else isn't laughing. They're sweating. Because in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's mood was the weather forecast, and a sneeze could mean storms. You live under an absolute monarch, which sounds impressive until you realize absolute means your life belongs to him. If he likes you, you're showered with gifts, titles, maybe even a new robe. If he doesn't, you're showered with strangulation by silk bowstring. That's the Ottoman touch. Executions weren't messy beheadings. They preferred neatness. One moment you're sipping coffee, the next moment 2 guards politely slip a scarf around your neck, and poof, no more you. And it's not just ministers and nobles who feel the Sultan's mood swings. Everyone does. Did the Sultan raise taxes? That's your goat gone. Did he decide to build a new palace? That's your labour drafted. Did he order a war? Congratulations, your son is marching to Hungary with mouldy boots and no chance of returning. The Sultan's paranoia was legendary. Many practiced fratricide, killing their own brothers upon taking the throne. Imagine waking up knowing your entire family tree is pruning itself for survival. Some sultans killed dozens of siblings in a single day just to keep things tidy. You thought sibling rivalry was rough. Try the Ottoman version, where the winner gets Constantinople and the loser gets a shallow grave. Even the harem wasn't safe. The mother of the Sultan, the powerful Valide Sultan, could make or break careers with a single word. Concubines plotted constantly, eunuchs schemed in the shadows, and every decision ultimately led back to the man at the centre, the Sultan, moody, unpredictable, and always above the law. For you, an ordinary subject, this means living in constant low-level panic. Maybe today he sneezes and orders a festival. Maybe he sneezes and orders a new war. Maybe he sneezes and orders half the viziers strangled just to clear his sinuses. You don't know, and that's the point. In the Ottoman Empire, survival wasn't about hard work or good deeds. It was about luck. The kind of luck where you pray the Sultan's lunch agrees with him. Because one upset stomach at the palace could mean an upset empire. You hear drums in the distance. At first you think maybe it's a wedding. Maybe you'll get invited. Maybe you'll score some roasted lamb. Then you see them. It's not a wedding. It's the Janissaries. The Janissaries were the Sultan's elite troops. And if you're imagining knights in shining armour protecting the innocent, think again. These were boys taken through the devshirme system, basically child tax. If you were Christian in the Balkans, Ottoman officials could roll into your village, point at your son and say, "We'll take that one." Off he went, never to be seen again. He'd be converted to Islam, drilled for years, and transformed into a soldier with no family ties, no distractions, and an unsettling loyalty to the Sultan. Congratulations. Your kid just became a cog in the Ottoman war machine. And these soldiers weren't just strong. They were terrifying. Their training made them disciplined killing machines, and their reputation alone could clear a street faster than the plague. If Janissaries are marching past your house, you don't wave. You hide behind the door and pray they're not in the mood to borrow your food. Being a Janissary wasn't all glory either. Sure, you got fine uniforms, steady pay, and the best weapons money could buy, but you were also forbidden from marrying or owning property for much of Ottoman history. Your life belonged to the barracks. Picture lifelong military service with none of the leave days. You fight, you march, you fight again. If the Sultan is generous, you get bonuses. If he isn't, you get mutiny. Yes, mutiny. The Janissaries eventually grew so powerful they could overthrow sultans. Imagine, The very soldiers raised to be loyal watchdogs became the empire's biggest political bullies. One late paycheck, one unpopular law, and suddenly the Janissaries are storming the palace, deposing the Sultan and looting the treasury. For the ordinary citizen, this meant chaos. Burned shops, raided food stores, riots in the capital. For you, standing in the street watching their boots thunder past, it's not about admiration. It's about survival. Keep your eyes down, don't make a sound, and pray they don't decide you look suspicious. The Janissaries didn't need much of an excuse. So, no, this isn't a parade. It's a reminder that in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's fist came with drums, muskets, and soldiers who didn't remember their mothers' faces. And they definitely didn't care about yours. You're standing in the marketplace, stomach empty, taxes fresh out of your pocket, and Janissaries still echoing in your ears. You mutter under your breath, "This is unfair." Congratulations. You just committed career suicide. In the Ottoman Empire, complaining wasn't a hobby, it was a crime. Free speech wasn't free. It wasn't even discounted. The Sultan and his officials didn't want your hot takes on taxes, war, or bread prices. They wanted silence, obedience, and maybe your goat. One careless complaint could brand you a rebel, a heretic, or worse, a traitor. And traitors didn't get warnings. They got silk bowstrings. Imagine this. 2 polite palace guards show up at your door at night, smiling warmly, carrying what looks like a scarf. You think, how thoughtful. Then you realise it's for strangling you. Ottomans prided themselves on tidy executions. No blood, no mess, just a quiet removal. Like taking out the trash. Even in casual conversation, you had to watch your tongue. Gossip at the coffee house? Dangerous. Jokes about the Sultan? Fatal. Complaints about Janissaries? That's suicide plus interest. The walls didn't just have ears. The barista pouring your coffee might be a snitch. Not that officials cared much about accuracy. If someone accused you of complaining, that was often enough. Maybe a jealous neighbour said you grumbled about bread prices. Maybe a rival merchant claimed you mocked the Sultan's turban. Congratulations again. You're guilty. Trial? If you're lucky. More often, it's straight to punishment. And punishment came in flavours. For minor grumbling, maybe flogging in the public square. For bigger offences, prison or exile. For the unlucky, that's you. Execution. Public, preferably. Nothing teaches loyalty faster than watching someone else's head roll while you chew stale bread. So, you learn to keep your mouth shut. You nod at officials, smile at guards, and say things like, "Yes, the tax system is very fair," while your insides scream otherwise. Survival means becoming fluent in hypocrisy. Because in the Ottoman Empire, complaining didn't change anything. It just changed your status from a live citizen to example for everyone else. And really, is that the hill you want to die on? Bread prices? After a long day of taxes, paranoia, and pretending the Sultan's sneeze didn't terrify you, you decide to relax. And in Ottoman cities, relaxation means one thing: the coffee house. At first, it feels like heaven. The air smells of roasted beans, tiny cups of strong black coffee are passed around, and men are crowded at low tables, talking, playing backgammon, and arguing about poetry. For 5 minutes you think, maybe this empire isn't so bad. Then you open your mouth. Coffee houses weren't just places to sip caffeine. They were political minefields disguised as social clubs. The Sultan's officials knew this too, which is why coffee houses were sometimes banned altogether. Authorities claimed coffee was a sinful stimulant. Translation: we don't like you peasants getting together and sharing ideas. Because once people with empty stomachs start gossiping about empty treasuries, rebellions usually follow. So, you sip your cup carefully. The man across from you jokes, "The Sultan spends more on turbans than soldiers." Everyone chuckles nervously, including you. Congratulations, you've just been implicated in treason. If the wrong ears heard that, you'd all be rounded up faster than the dice on your backgammon board. And those wrong ears are everywhere. Spies loved coffee houses. It was the perfect setup. Pour a cup, sit quietly, and collect gossip. The Sultan didn't need newspapers when he had an army of tattletales listening to peasants complain about bread, taxes, or the latest war. If your name ended up in their notes, good luck convincing anyone you were just kidding. Humour didn't exist in Ottoman law. Even when coffee wasn't banned, the authorities raided shops at random. Guards could storm in, flip tables and drag out the loudest talkers. One day you're sipping coffee, the next you're being interrogated in a dark cell about why you laughed too hard at a satirical poem. So, you sit quietly, stirring your drink, trying not to look suspicious. But in the Ottoman Empire, silence could be suspicious too. If you weren't complaining, maybe you were plotting. If you were complaining, you were definitely plotting. Either way, you lose. You finish your cup, thank the host, and shuffle home, paranoid that half the room is following you. That's the Ottoman coffee house, a place where you went to wake up, but often ended up never waking up again. You've heard the rumours. The Ottoman imperial harem, a paradise of silk, jewels and women lounging around in luxury. You picture fountains, music, and maybe grapes being fed to you. Wrong. Very wrong. Let's say you're a concubine. You weren't invited here. You were brought. Maybe captured in war. Maybe sold by your family. Maybe gifted to the Sultan like some bizarre fruit basket. You're dressed in fine clothes now, yes, but those clothes are also prison uniforms. The harem is not freedom. It's a gilded cage with better curtains. Your day begins with lessons, music, embroidery, and etiquette. Then more lessons, politics, languages, and how not to get murdered by rivals. Because here's the catch. You're not competing for fun. You're competing for survival. The Sultan may choose you, or he may never look your way. If he does, congratulations. Your status skyrockets. If not, you're just another face in a crowded room, waiting for time to swallow you whole. And the politics? They're brutal. Every concubine is scheming, whispering, bribing eunuchs, or slipping questionable herbs into rivals' food. One wrong move, and you don't just lose the Sultan's attention. You lose your life. Some concubines were retired to remote cloisters, which is a nice way of saying, enjoy loneliness until you die. Others ended up poisoned, strangled, or simply gone. Then there's the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She runs the place like a CEO with zero tolerance for nonsense. One word from her, and your future is sealed. She can make you Queen Mother, or she can make you yesterday's ashes. Best to stay on her good side, which is tricky since she doesn't actually have one. And don't think being a eunuch is better. Sure, you get to live in the palace, but only because you've been permanently disqualified from certain activities. Your job is guarding women who resent you, serving masters who distrust you, and enforcing rules you secretly wish didn't exist. You're less a person and more a lock on a door. So no, the harem isn't the fantasy paradise of paintings and legends. It's politics, poison, and paranoia dressed up in silk robes. You thought it was sexy. Turns out it's just survival with better furniture. After watching the harem eat itself alive, you decide maybe politics is safer. You think, I'll be a vizier, wear fancy robes, make important decisions, easy money. Spoiler, you won't last 5 minutes. The Ottoman bureaucracy was enormous, a labyrinth of scribes, ministers, judges, and advisors. On the surface, it looks impressive. Men in turbans scribbling on scrolls, stamping documents, looking important. But underneath, it's a minefield. One wrong suggestion and you're not promoted, you're executed. Let's say you make it into the divan, the imperial council. You sit across from the Grand Vizier himself, the Sultan's right-hand man. Everyone whispers that he's basically the second most powerful person in the empire. What they don't mention is that second most powerful also makes him first most replaceable. Grand Viziers were strangled so often it was practically part of the job description. You could spend 20 years clawing your way to the top and still end your career with a bowstring around your neck. And don't think you'll survive by playing it safe. If the Sultan asks, should we invade Hungary again? You can't say, Maybe wait, sire. No. You smile and say, "Brilliant idea, Your Majesty," while mentally drafting your will. If the campaign fails, guess who gets blamed? You. If it succeeds, guess who gets credit? Not you. Even paperwork is dangerous. Forget to record one shipment of grain. Treason. Lose a letter from the Sultan. Treason. Misplace the tax revenue. Double treason, plus a public flogging for style points. The empire ran on taxes, and if the books didn't add up, neither would your lifespan. And then there's the constant scheming. Every rival official wants your seat. They bribe, they whisper, they send anonymous notes accusing you of corruption. Spoiler. Everyone is corrupt, but it's only a crime when it's your turn to be scapegoated. So yes, you might dream of rising through the ranks, but the reality is worse than farming. At least a farmer only fears famine. A bureaucrat fears famine and strangulation, and being framed for treason over a typo. By the time you've survived 1 week in the Ottoman bureaucracy, you'll be begging to go back to your goat and your crumbly bread. At least goats don't stab you in the back, figuratively anyway. You gave up on politics, so you head back to the fields. Farming, simple, honest work, right? Wrong. In the Ottoman Empire, farming is basically legalized suffering, where you work yourself into the ground and then hand most of the harvest to people who never touched a plough in their lives. You wake before dawn, muscles already aching, and drag yourself into the fields. Wheat, barley, grapes. Whatever you're growing, it's not yours. It belongs to the Sultan, or the local Sipahi, a cavalryman with a land grant who shows up once in a while to remind you of your place. You're technically the tenant, which is a polite way of saying free labour with rent attached. Your day is back-breaking, ploughing with wooden tools that snap more often than they work, sowing seed while praying for rain, harvesting under the sun until your skin feels like leather. And just when you think you've produced enough to feed your family, the taxman arrives. He takes the first share. The landlord takes the second. The army might take the third. By the time it's your turn, you're lucky if you get a sack of barley and some shriveled onions. And heaven forbid there's a bad harvest. Drought, locusts, flood. Too bad. The taxes don't shrink. You'll still owe the Sultan the same amount, which means handing over what little food you have and praying your kids can survive on boiled weeds. If you're really desperate, you'll steal from your own fields at night just to feed your family, which is ironic, since it's technically your food in the first place. Farm life doesn't come with peace either. Armies tramp through fields on their way to war, trampling your crops into mud. Bandits raid villages, stealing what's left. Disease spreads every summer, thinning your workforce. And you can't exactly call HR about unsafe working conditions when HR is a mounted soldier who thinks your suffering is adorable. By winter, survival means rationing mouldy bread and hoping spring comes before your children start chewing on furniture. And if you somehow make it to the next harvest, congratulations. You get to do it all over again. So yes, farming in the Ottoman Empire was simple. Simple in the sense that it simply broke your body, stole your food, and left you with just enough energy to regret being born. You've had enough of farming, so maybe the army will be better. At least as a soldier, you'll get food, pay, and some respect, right? Wrong. In the Ottoman Empire, military service meant endless marching, endless suffering, and pay that arrived late, if at all. You're handed a musket or a spear, depending on how valued you are. Spoiler, you're not valued. Your boots are thin leather that fall apart halfway through your first campaign. By day 3, your feet look like boiled meat. By day 10, you're praying for amputation. The marches go on forever. The empire stretched from Hungary to Arabia, which means you're expected to walk across entire continents like it's no big deal. Rain? You keep walking. Snow? You keep walking. Desert heat melting your eyeballs? Keep walking. If you collapse, nobody carries you. You just become scenery for the next unlucky recruit. And the food. Imagine stale bread so hard you could use it as a weapon. Add a handful of dried chickpeas, maybe a thin soup that tastes suspiciously like boiled sock water. If you're lucky, there's meat, but only if the quartermaster didn't sell it to a tavern on the side. Spoiler again, he did. Then there's the discipline. Complain about the conditions, and the janissary sergeant smacks you. Complain louder and you're whipped. Complain too much, and you're executed for undermining morale. Nothing says team spirit like watching your buddy get strangled because he dared to say the bread was mouldy. And when you finally reach the battlefield, you realise the march was the easy part. You're shoved into the front lines against armoured knights, cannon fire, or angry peasants with pitchforks who'd rather die than pay Ottoman taxes. The janissaries behind you make sure you don't run. It's not bravery keeping you in formation. It's the knowledge that you'll be killed faster by your own side than by the enemy. Even victories aren't sweet. If you win, you get maybe a few coins, some loot, and a new pair of boots, which fall apart just as quickly as the last ones. If you lose, you don't come back. Simple as that. You think to yourself, maybe I'll bend the rules a little. Everyone else does. Bad idea. In the Ottoman Empire, crime and punishment wasn't a legal system. It was a horror show with better costumes. Let's say you steal something small, like a loaf of bread. In modern times, maybe you'd get a slap on the wrist. In the Ottoman Empire, you're about to lose the whole hand. Theft was met with amputation. Neat, tidy, and effective. After all, it's hard to steal again when you can't hold anything. What if you lied in court? Simple. Flogging. Public, noisy, humiliating flogging. The idea was that pain builds character, but mostly it just builds scars. And if you were caught cheating in the marketplace, inspectors didn't just fine you. They could nail your ear to your stall as a warning. Congratulations. You're now part of the shop's decor. Bigger crimes, like treason, required bigger drama. Forget long speeches or drawn-out trials. The Ottomans had a favourite method: strangulation with a silk bowstring. Why silk? Because blood was messy, and the Sultan liked things neat. Imagine two smiling palace guards politely wrapping silk around your neck. No guillotine, no axe, just luxury suffocation. Blasphemy? That could get you burned or exiled, depending on the mood of the court. Insult the Sultan? Immediate death. Accidentally bump into the wrong janissary in the street? Also possibly death. Honestly, in the Ottoman Empire, everything felt like it could get you killed. You could probably die for sneezing too close to a mosque on a Friday. And then there were examples. Sometimes punishments weren't about justice at all. They were about spectacle. A thief might be paraded through the streets before execution, a rebel's head might be displayed on a spike, and traitors were sometimes buried alive. Nothing says, "Don't try this at home," like a body rotting on the city gates. Of course, punishments weren't always fair. Bribe the right official, and your crimes disappeared. Annoy the wrong official, and suddenly you're guilty of crimes you didn't commit. The system was less rule of law, and more roulette with your life as the bet. At last, the sun sets. You survived the taxes, the gossip, the Sultan's sneeze, and even the janissaries stomping through town. You flop onto your straw mat, desperate for rest. Surely, finally, you'll get a moment of peace. But no, just as your eyelids droop, the drums begin. War drums, parade drums, ceremonial drums. In the Ottoman Empire, there was always a drum. The janissaries loved them. The palace loved them. Even the neighbourhood loved them, because nothing says relaxing evening like a pounding rhythm that reminds you your life belongs to the empire. You pull a blanket over your head, but it doesn't help. The drums echo through every alley, bounce off every wall, and lodge themselves in your skull. You can't sleep through them. You can barely think through them. But that's the point. They aren't just instruments, they're announcements. They tell you the army is moving, the Sultan is celebrating, or that something very important is happening that you're not invited to, but will definitely pay for later. And it's not just drums. The muezzin calls to prayer echo 5 times a day, including before dawn. The markets never shut up. Even the neighbour's goat seems to be rehearsing for a solo. Ottoman cities were alive, yes, but alive in the sense of never shutting up. Ever. Maybe you think, fine, I'll move to the countryside. It's quieter there. Wrong. Out in the villages, you're haunted by different sounds. Wolves in the woods, soldiers marching past on campaign, or the tax collector's horse approaching in the dead of night. The only quiet you'll hear is when your food runs out and your stomach growls louder than anything else. So, you toss and turn. Every creak of wood makes you think of guards. Every beat of the drum makes you wonder, war, a festival, another sultan's sneeze that turned into a national event? You don't know, and that's the worst part. The uncertainty. By morning you haven't really slept. Your back hurts, your eyes sting, and your mind races with paranoia. You're not refreshed. You're just more tired, more anxious, and somehow hungrier than the night before. In the Ottoman Empire, even sleep wasn't a guarantee. It was another battle you usually lost. The sun rises again, though you swear you never slept. Your body aches from lying on straw, your stomach growls because bread isn't food, and your nerves are fried from the endless war drums that pounded through the night. Congratulations. You've officially survived one day in the Ottoman Empire. Except you haven't, really, because now the cycle starts all over again. The tax collector could knock any minute, demanding the chicken you don't even own. If you mutter a complaint, a neighbour might report you for treason. If you stumble into a coffee house for comfort, one wrong laugh could get you accused of blasphemy. If you dream of joining the bureaucracy, don't. You'll just end up strangled with silk for writing the wrong word on the wrong piece of paper. Even farming, the safe job, is just legalised starvation dressed up as honest labour. The army is worse. Endless marches, rotten boots, stale bread, and maybe a heroic death in Hungary if the enemy doesn't kill you first. The Sultan. You never know if his sneeze means a holiday or your execution. The harem. That's not a dream. It's a nightmare with better wallpaper. And sleep? Forget about it. Between the prayers, the drums, the soldiers, the gossip, and your own stomach making noises like a dying goat, rest is just another fantasy. You might as well stay awake all night. It won't make you feel any worse. By now, you've realised the truth. The Ottoman Empire wasn't built for you. It was built for the Sultan, the army, and the bureaucracy that squeezed you like a lemon until there was nothing left to give. You're not a citizen. You're a resource. A very tired, underfed, paranoid resource. So, when the morning light creeps through the cracks in your wall and you drag yourself up for another round of bread, taxes and fear, you know deep down you wouldn't last another day. Honestly, you barely survived this one. Life in the Ottoman Empire wasn't about living. It was about avoiding death long enough to hand over your last goat. And odds are, you already failed. So yes, the history books talk about glorious palaces, mighty armies and golden ages. But you? You're just the exhausted peasant in the footnotes. Step into a medieval castle and you'll find grandeur in the great hall, tapestries hanging on stone walls and soldiers standing at the ready. But eventually, someone had to ask the most practical of questions. Where did everyone go to the toilet? The answer, at least for the wealthy, was the garderobe, a small chamber built into the castle walls, usually overhanging a moat or ditch. To the medieval mind, this was considered a convenience bordering on luxury. A garderobe wasn't a toilet as we think of it today. Instead, it was a stone or wooden seat with a hole cut into it, leading directly down the outer wall. Whatever you left behind dropped straight into the moat, a pit, or sometimes onto unsuspecting invaders. That's right. Castles didn't just use their toilets for hygiene. They occasionally turned them into part of their defence system. An enemy scaling the wall might suddenly be greeted with a less than chivalrous welcome from above. Inside, the garderobe was hardly glamorous. There was no privacy to speak of, just a narrow chamber, often dark and cold, with a draught creeping in from the chute below. In fact, garderobe literally comes from the idea of guarding clothes. People would hang cloaks inside, believing the foul air helped keep fleas and moths away. So while you relieved yourself, your garments were supposedly being purified by the stench. Practical? Perhaps. Pleasant? Absolutely not. The smell was constant, and the sanitation questionable. Waste didn't just vanish, it collected below, sometimes making the moat a foul-smelling cesspit. During sieges, when waste disposal became impossible, the odour could grow unbearable, and disease could spread quickly. Imagine knights preparing for battle while holding their noses against the stench rising from their own castle walls. Still, compared to peasants who squatted in fields or shared communal pits, a garderobe was a step above. For nobles, it meant a designated space, private enough, sturdy enough, and even useful as part of the castle's architecture. It was both a privilege and a reminder that medieval luxury often came with a side of filth. In the end, the garderobe was less about comfort and more about function. It symbolised how medieval society dealt with life's most basic need, not by eliminating the problem, but by dropping it on the other side of the wall and hoping it stayed there. If the garderobe was the castle's version of high-class sanitation, then communal privies were the reality for townsfolk and peasants. Forget privacy. In the Middle Ages, using the toilet was often a shared experience, and that meant sitting shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours. These privies were essentially long benches with multiple holes carved in a row, built over pits or streams. Some could seat a dozen people at once. Conversation wasn't just possible, it was almost unavoidable. The logic behind communal privies was straightforward. In growing medieval towns, thousands of people lived within cramped walls. There simply wasn't space for each household to dig its own latrine. Instead, city authorities built large shared facilities, sometimes maintained by guilds or even monasteries. In fact, monks were among the first to organise such spaces, building long stone-lined latrines that emptied into flowing water. Sanitation may have been the goal, but the outcome wasn't always pleasant. Imagine the smell of dozens of people using the same pit every day, combined with the lack of proper cleaning. Waste would pile up, seep into the soil, or overflow into streets when neglected. During rains, runoff could carry filth into wells or rivers, contaminating the very water people drank. Unsurprisingly, outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases often followed. A bad privy wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. And yet, for many medieval townsfolk, the communal privy was still better than the alternative. Human waste dumped into streets, alleys, or chamber pots, flung from windows, could choke a city with filth. At least a communal privy gathered the problem in one place. Some wealthier towns even attempted primitive waste management systems, paying gong farmers to shovel out the pits at night. These men, often working in near darkness, hauled barrels of waste beyond the city walls to be buried. An unenviable but essential job. Despite the hazards, communal privies were social hubs in their own way. Gossip spread as quickly there as in the marketplace. You might trade news of a distant crusade, complain about a tax collector, or share a laugh while waiting for your turn on the bench. Privacy was a luxury for the elite. For everyone else, bodily functions were simply another part of community life. Crude as they were, these privies reflected the medieval balancing act between necessity and practicality. A reminder that when survival took priority, even sanitation became a public affair. If castles had garderobes and towns had communal privies, the average medieval street was still the final destination for much of Europe's waste. The truth is, sanitation systems were inconsistent, and for many, the simplest solution was to throw it all out the window. Chamber pots were the most common household toilet. At night, you did your business, and in the morning, you or your servant would toss the contents into the street with a quick warning cry. In France, gardez-l'eau. Watch out for the water. Few people listened, and fewer dodged in time. The result was a stinking mixture of human waste, animal manure, food scraps, and whatever else people discarded. Streets often doubled as open sewers, with runoff slowly trickling down toward rivers or ditches. In wealthier towns, some streets had shallow stone channels designed to carry waste away, but these were rarely cleaned, and the stench lingered year-round. Imagine walking through a crowded market while carefully avoiding puddles of filth underfoot. That was daily life in medieval cities. The situation worsened because animals shared the streets. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and pigs all left behind their own contributions. By some estimates, the dung of a single horse could pile up to over 10 pounds a day. Multiply that by dozens of animals moving through a busy street, and it's easy to picture why sanitation became a nightmare. Shoes weren't just for style. They were shields against disease. Authorities tried to fight back. City councils issued regulations, fining citizens for tossing waste too carelessly or for letting pigs roam free. Some towns even appointed officials to supervise street cleaning. Yet enforcement was patchy, and medieval infrastructure couldn't keep up with the growing population. Public health crises like outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and plague thrived in these conditions. The Black Death itself spread partly due to unsanitary streets, where rats and fleas found perfect breeding grounds. Despite the filth, people adapted. Wooden walkways sometimes ran along the worst-smelling alleys, and wealthier households hired servants to discreetly dispose of waste in fields outside town. But for the majority, stepping outside meant confronting the unavoidable reality of a city that smelled as much of life as of death. The medieval street wasn't just a place of commerce and community. It was also a reminder that sanitation, or the lack of it, shaped everyday survival. While city streets stank and castles relied on their drafty garderobes, monasteries stood out as some of the cleanest spaces in medieval Europe. Monks may have devoted their lives to prayer and study, but they also understood the very practical importance of sanitation. A monastery was a self-contained world, with its own water supply, kitchens, dormitories, and yes, toilets. These weren't simply for convenience. They reflected a belief that cleanliness was linked to godliness. Many monasteries built long, stone-lined latrines, often called reredauters, attached directly to the dormitory. Picture a row of wooden seats over a running water channel, designed so that waste was carried away downstream. Compared to the foul pits of towns, this was a remarkable innovation. Monks could relieve themselves in relative privacy, while water flow kept the facilities from becoming unbearable. In fact, some orders like the Cistercians became famous for their advanced use of water engineering, diverting streams not only for toilets, but also for mills and fish ponds. Of course, clean is relative. While monasteries had a better system, the smell didn't vanish, and disease still lingered in close quarters. Still, compared to the chaos outside the cloister walls, monasteries were sanitary havens. Their systems even influenced later medieval urban planning, as towns sought to imitate monastic waterworks for public use. Sanitation in monasteries wasn't just practical, it carried a moral weight. Monks believed that idleness was dangerous for the soul, and cleanliness was a form of discipline. Maintaining the reredaughter, sweeping cloisters, or ensuring water channels were clear all became acts of service to God. The physical act of keeping waste away symbolized spiritual purification. Interestingly, monks had to follow strict rules about when and how they used the latrine. Silence was often enforced, and talking while using the facilities was frowned upon. This stood in stark contrast to the lively chatter of communal town privies. For monks, even relieving oneself was to be done with humility and restraint. Monasteries reveal a medieval paradox. While most of Europe struggled with filth, the Church, often criticized for its wealth, pioneered some of the most advanced sanitary practices of the age. Their reredaughters were not only practical, but also deeply symbolic, blending the physical needs of the body with the spiritual discipline of the soul. If monasteries had their water channels and castles had their garderobes, someone still had to deal with what piled up in the cesspits of towns and cities. Enter the gong farmers, also known as nightmen, the unsung and often unwanted heroes of medieval sanitation. Their job was simple in theory, but horrific in practice, digging out human waste from privy pits, cesspools and sewers. The word gong didn't mean a bell, it meant filth, and that's exactly what these men waded into. By law, gong farmers worked only at night, when the streets were quieter and the smell slightly less offensive. Armed with shovels, buckets and carts, they descended into waist-deep pits of sludge, shoveling human waste into barrels. Once filled, these barrels were hauled outside the city walls, where the contents might be buried, dumped, or occasionally sold as fertilizer. It was foul, dangerous work, and one slip could literally mean drowning in filth. Despite the disgust their trade inspired, gong farmers were necessary. Without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste far faster than they already did. In fact, medieval laws sometimes offered them high wages compared to common labourers, because so few were willing to take on the job. But money didn't erase the stigma. Gong farmers often lived on the outskirts of town, shunned by neighbours, and sometimes forced to wear distinctive clothing so others could avoid them in public. The smell clung to their skin no matter how much they washed. The risks went beyond stench and social shame. Cesspits released toxic gases, methane and hydrogen sulfide, that could suffocate workers without warning. Historical records describe gong farmers collapsing mid-task, overcome by fumes. Their work gear was primitive, offering little protection. Even when they survived, constant exposure to disease carried its toll, and yet medieval society couldn't do without them. Cities might fine people for throwing chamber pot waste into the street, but without gong farmers, pits would overflow and become health disasters. These nightmen kept urban life possible, though no one thanked them for it. In a strange way, gong farmers were both despised and indispensable. They lived in the shadows, performing a job that nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everybody relied upon. Their existence is a reminder that medieval sanitation was a system built not only on stone walls and water channels, but also on human hands willing to dig through the muck of society's dirtiest necessity. It may sound absurd today, but in the Middle Ages, even toilets could play a role in warfare and defence. Castles weren't just military fortresses, they were also homes and garderobes. Those narrow latrine chambers built into walls became both a practical feature and a potential weak point in a siege. For the defenders, garderobes had an unintentional advantage. Waste often fell directly into the moat or onto the ground below. An unlucky attacker scaling the wall might find himself showered with more than arrows. Chroniclers joke about defenders deliberately emptying chamber pots onto enemies, and while it sounds like slapstick humour, it was also psychological warfare. Few things demoralised a soldier faster than being drenched in filth before even reaching the battlements. But garderobes were double-edged swords. From an engineering perspective, cutting a chute through thick stone walls created a weak spot. Some attackers quickly realised that garderobes could serve as secret entry points. The hole at the bottom, usually large enough for waste to flow freely, was sometimes big enough for a man to squeeze through. In 1204, during the siege of Château Gaillard in France, attackers are said to have entered the fortress through the garderobe chute, bypassing the outer defences entirely. What was meant for waste disposal became a back door for invaders. This risk didn't go unnoticed by medieval architects. As castles evolved, some garderobes were built to drop waste directly into moats filled with water, making them harder to climb. Others were angled sharply downward, so anyone attempting to crawl inside would meet a sheer, slippery shaft of stone. Still, the vulnerability remained, and seasoned defenders kept a wary eye on their own latrines. Beyond strategy, garderobes symbolised the medieval blending of everyday life with defence. A castle wasn't just a military base, it was a small city where cooking, sleeping, praying, and relieving oneself all had to fit within thick walls designed to withstand siege engines. The garderobe is a reminder that even the most mundane human necessity could turn into a matter of life, death, and military ingenuity. So, the next time you picture a knight in shining armour storming a fortress, remember that he might have been battling not only arrows and boiling oil, but also the castle's less glamorous waste disposal system raining down from above. While nobles had garderobes and townsfolk made do with communal privies, the vast majority of medieval people, peasants, had to take care of business in the most basic way possible, wherever they could. For those living in the countryside, the toilet was rarely more than a patch of open ground, the edge of a field, or the bank of a river. Nature itself served as the medieval peasant's restroom. A common practice was to squat in fields, especially those not currently used for crops. In some cases, waste wasn't just discarded, it was deliberately left to act as fertilizer. This was risky, of course, since untreated human waste could spread parasites and disease, but with little scientific understanding of hygiene, peasants often saw it as simply part of the cycle of life. Livestock manure was already used for enriching soil, so human contributions weren't viewed much differently. Rivers and streams offered another option: easy, quick, and free-flowing. Waterways carried waste away, but they also carried it into the same streams where peasants washed clothes, fetched water, or bathed. The line between clean and dirty water was blurry at best, and outbreaks of disease often followed. Yet to a medieval villager with no access to organised sanitation, this was the only practical solution. Makeshift latrines also existed. A shallow pit might be dug near a home and covered once full, but this required effort and space, which not all peasants had. More often, people simply relieved themselves outdoors, sometimes in the company of neighbours. Privacy was a luxury. The idea of needing a locked door or a personal chamber for such things was foreign to most rural folk. Despite the filth, peasants adapted with humour and resilience. Folk sayings and jokes about bodily functions were common, perhaps as a way of making light of a daily necessity. Children, unsurprisingly, were often tasked with emptying chamber pots if the household had one, a chore as dreaded then as it would be now. Peasant sanitation reflects a truth often overlooked. While castles and monasteries left behind stone ruins and records of innovation, most of medieval Europe relieved itself in fields and rivers, leaving little behind but a story of practicality over comfort. For peasants, survival mattered more than refinement, and toilets, like so many aspects of their lives, were rough, communal, and unremarkably human. Toilets in the Middle Ages weren't only about convenience, they were deeply tied to how people understood health and disease. Medieval medicine revolved around the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed that sickness came from imbalances in these fluids, and waste leaving the body was considered a vital sign of whether balance was being maintained. In other words, excrement was both feared and studied. Doctors sometimes examined urine, feces, and even the smell of waste to diagnose illnesses. Uroscopy, the examination of urine, became an entire field of study. Physicians carried charts of colours and textures, comparing samples in glass flasks. A deep yellow liquid might mean dehydration, while cloudiness suggested an infection. The toilet, or whatever passed for one, was not just a place of relief, but also a stage where health revealed itself. But alongside this proto-scientific approach, superstition thrived. People believed that bad smells carried disease, a theory called miasma. Since privies and cesspits were among the foulest-smelling places, they were often blamed for outbreaks. Communities burned herbs or carried scented flowers to ward off bad air. While miasma theory was incorrect, it wasn't entirely useless. At least it encouraged efforts to mask or avoid filth. Superstitions went further. Some thought that demons lurked in latrines, ready to strike when a person was most vulnerable. Folktales warned children against lingering too long over pits or streams. Others claimed that witches could use waste in curses, stealing bits of hair, urine, or feces to cast spells. The toilet, in this sense, was both a practical necessity and a spiritual danger. In monasteries, the act of relieving oneself was treated with solemnity, as if even the body's most basic needs could affect the soul. Meanwhile, in villages, charms or blessings might be whispered before squatting in a field, particularly at night, to ward off spirits. These beliefs reveal how waste occupied a strange place in medieval thought. It was a sign of health, a potential carrier of disease, a source of magical power, and a reminder of humanity's fragility. Even in the most ordinary act of going to the toilet, medieval people saw the hand of God, the threat of demons, and the balance of nature at work. When we look back at the toilets of the Middle Ages, it's easy to laugh at the crude methods, the smells, and the sheer lack of privacy. But sanitation in that era wasn't just about filth. It was a mirror of medieval life itself. Castles, monasteries, towns and villages all developed their own ways of coping with humanity's most basic need, and in doing so, they revealed the values and limits of their world. For nobles, the garderobe symbolized privilege. It may have been a cold, draughty hole in the wall, but it separated them from the peasants squatting in fields. Monasteries, on the other hand, remind us that not all of medieval Europe was wallowing in dirt. Their flowing water latrines and carefully managed waste channels show how engineering, religion, and practicality could work hand in hand. Monks saw sanitation as both necessity and virtue, a link between bodily discipline and spiritual order. Cities exposed the dangers of growth without infrastructure. Communal privies overflowed, cesspits leaked, and streets turned into sewers. The gong farmers kept things functioning at night, but disease was never far away. These conditions paved the way for some of history's deadliest epidemics, from waves of dysentery to the Black Death. In this sense, toilets, or the lack of them, shaped the fate of entire populations. Peasant practices, too, remind us of medieval resilience. Fields doubled as toilets, rivers carried away waste, and humour softened the indignity. For them, sanitation was never about luxury. It was about survival, practicality, and making do with whatever nature provided. The legacy of medieval toilets lies in their paradox. They were both ingenious and crude, both practical and hazardous. They served as weapons in sieges, tools of diagnosis for physicians, and sources of superstition for villagers. Sanitation was never just about cleanliness. It was about how people understood the body, society, and even the soul. In the centuries that followed, many of these systems would evolve into early modern sewers and public health reforms. But in the Middle Ages, toilets were a messy, unavoidable reminder that no matter your rank, faith, or fortune, everyone shared the same human reality. Castles, monasteries, towns, and villages all smelled the same truth. Sanitation was civilization's constant struggle. When we think of the Bronze Age, most people picture warriors with bronze swords, farmers tilling fields, or the rise of early cities. But tucked into the story of this era is another innovation, one just as important to human history: the discovery of fermentation. Long before medieval monks perfected beer in cloisters or Vikings raised horns of mead, Bronze Age people were already crafting intoxicating brews that bound their communities together. Archaeologists didn't learn this from ancient texts, since most Bronze Age societies left none. Instead, the secrets came from chemistry. Residue analysis of pottery jars and drinking vessels has revealed the fingerprints of barley starch, wild yeast, and honey sugars. These weren't accidental spills. They were the remnants of early brewing experiments, proving that Bronze Age people understood, at least in practice, how to harness fermentation. But what exactly did their drinks taste like? Forget the golden, filtered beers of today. Bronze Age beer was thick and cloudy, more like a liquid bread than a refreshing lager. Grains were mashed and left to ferment in large communal vats. Sometimes honey or herbs were added, creating primitive mead or spiced ales. The result was mildly alcoholic, nutritious, and unpredictable. Each batch could vary wildly, depending on the water, the grain, and the whims of wild yeast. And yet, these brews mattered. Alcohol offered more than a buzz. It preserved calories in a stable form and provided safe hydration when water sources were questionable. In small doses, it had antiseptic qualities, killing off microbes that plagued early settlements. To drink together was to share trust. Each sip showed that you belonged at the table, part of the group. More than that, brewing revealed a shift in human priorities. By the Bronze Age, people weren't just farming to survive. They were farming to create surpluses, which meant they could afford luxuries like fermented drinks. Beer and mead weren't about bare survival. They were about culture, ritual, and even identity. To brew was to signal prosperity, to show that your community had enough grain to eat and enough left over to drink. So, While bronze weapons and ploughs might symbolize the technology of the age, the humble brewing jar tells another story. Civilization wasn't just forged in metal and fire, it was also fermented in clay pots, where grain and honey transformed into the first intoxicating drinks of human history. If Bronze Age brewing gave people their first intoxicating drinks, the feast gave those drinks a purpose. Across Europe and the Near East, archaeologists have uncovered vast communal halls and open-air sites littered with animal bones, drinking vessels, and fire pits. These were not everyday meals. They were carefully staged events, moments when communities came together to eat, drink, and reaffirm their bonds. A feast was more than just a party. It was a political tool. Chieftains and emerging elites used the abundance of food and alcohol to display their wealth and generosity. By slaughtering dozens of cattle or pouring out honey mead for all to share, they signaled that they had control over resources and that they could afford to give them away. Guests, in turn, were reminded of who held power. In a world without written contracts or governments, the feast was a living contract, sealed not with ink, but with wine, meat, and laughter. Alcohol played a central role in these gatherings. Drinking together blurred boundaries between rich and poor, host and guest. Anthropologists call this commensality, the act of eating and drinking together as equals. But make no mistake, equality had limits. Who sat closest to the host, who received the choicest cut of meat, and who drank first from the communal cup, all carried social meaning. Every bite and sip reinforced hierarchy, even while creating the illusion of shared unity. Feasts also carried ritual significance. In many cases, offerings of food and drink were made to gods or ancestors before the first cup was raised. Some vessels discovered in burial sites show that feasting continued even in death. To drink from a communal jar was to connect with both the living and the dead, weaving spirituality into intoxication. These events could last for days, filled with music, dancing, and storytelling around roaring fires. They weren't just entertainment, they were cultural glue. For communities spread thin across valleys and mountains, the feast was a chance to see distant kin, forge alliances, and gossip about who was rising or falling in status. In short, the Bronze Age feast was where politics, ritual, and pleasure met. It wasn't simply about filling bellies, it was about filling the social order with meaning, binding people together one drink at a time. If the Bronze Age feast was the stage, then its star performers were the ingredients that made early brews possible. Archaeology has shown us that Bronze Age people experimented widely with barley, wheat, honey, herbs, and even fruits to create their intoxicating concoctions. Each ingredient carried not just flavour, but also cultural weight. Barley was the backbone of most Bronze Age beers. It was hardy, adaptable, and produced the starches that yeast could easily convert into alcohol. Barley wasn't just food, it was a symbol of fertility and prosperity. To transform it into beer was to turn a staple crop into a luxury, proof that your community had more than enough to survive. Wheat, meanwhile, often made brews smoother and more palatable, though it was less common than barley. Honey was the ingredient that turned simple grain drinks into mead, one of the oldest and most widespread alcoholic beverages in the world. Honey carried special significance because of its rarity. Unlike grain, it couldn't be farmed on a large scale. It had to be gathered, often at risk, from wild hives. This made honey mead a drink of prestige, associated with ritual, sacred offerings, and the favour of the gods. To share honey mead at a feast was to declare abundance, generosity, and perhaps even divine blessing. Bronze Age brewers didn't stop there. Herbs and spices like juniper, yarrow, and mint were added to enhance flavour and potency. Some of these had mild psychoactive or medicinal effects, which blurred the line between drinking for pleasure and drinking for ritual. Each batch was unique, reflecting the local landscape and the brewer's own creativity. And then there were fruits. Traces of grapes, apples, and berries show that people were experimenting with fermentation wherever sugars could be found. These fruit-based drinks may have been seasonal specialties, tied to harvest celebrations and feasts marking the turning of the year. Taken together, These ingredients show that Bronze Age brewing was as much about symbolism as it was about taste. Grains represented the labour of farming, honey the gifts of nature, herbs the knowledge of healers, and fruits the cycles of abundance. Every sip was layered with meaning, transforming drinking into a ritual act that connected people not only with one another, but with the land and the divine forces they believed governed it. So, how did Bronze Age communities actually transform raw grain and honey into the intoxicating drinks that fueled their feasts? Unlike the precise science of modern brewing, the process back then was a mix of experimentation, tradition, and what we might politely call controlled accidents. Still, residue evidence and ethnographic parallels give us a good picture of how it worked. The first step was malting. Barley or wheat grains were soaked in water until they sprouted, activating enzymes that converted starches into sugars. Once sprouted, the grains were dried in the sun or lightly roasted, halting the process but leaving behind the sweetness needed for fermentation. In essence, Bronze Age people had discovered a natural chemistry trick without knowing the science behind it. Next came mashing. The malted grains were crushed and mixed with hot water, creating a thick, porridge-like mixture. This slurry was often heated in large clay or bronze vessels, sometimes with hot stones dropped in from the fire. The heat extracted more sugars, which would later feed the wild yeast. To our modern eyes, it might have looked more like cooking soup than brewing beer. Then came fermentation, the magical stage when microbes did the work. Unlike modern brewers, who had carefully cultivated yeast strains, Bronze Age brewers relied on the yeast that lived naturally on grains, honey, and in the air. They simply left the mixture uncovered for days, allowing wild yeast to settle in and do its work. The result was unpredictable. Some batches fizzed and foamed into alcoholic brews, while others may have soured or spoiled. But when it worked, it produced a drink with enough alcohol to preserve itself for weeks or months. Flavourings could be added at almost any stage. Honey sweetened the brew, herbs brought bitterness or medicinal effects, and fruits added tangy complexity. The final product was strained and served in large communal jars or individual cups. Archaeological finds suggest that long straws were sometimes used to sip from shared vessels, filtering out grain husks as people drank together. The process was far from exact, but that was part of its charm. Brewing in the Bronze Age wasn't about consistency, it was about community. Each brew was tied to the land, the season, and the skill of the brewer. Every feast brought a slightly new flavour, a slightly different buzz, and the shared joy of transforming humble crops into something extraordinary. If brewing was the craft, then the feasting hall was the theatre where the performance unfolded. Across Bronze Age Europe and the Near East, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of long timber halls, fire pits, and ceremonial enclosures where hundreds of people once gathered. These were the places where beer and mead were consumed, and where community, ritual and politics were stirred together as easily as grain in a mash pot. A feasting hall was more than 4 walls and a roof. It was a stage for power. Chiefs and rising elites used feasts to cement their status, and the architecture reflected it. The central hearth dominated the space, where fires roared, meat roasted, and shadows danced on the timber beams. Around it, benches and low tables were arranged, with the most honoured guests sitting closest to the fire and the host. The placement of bodies in the hall mirrored the placement of power in society. At these gatherings, food was plentiful, but drink was the unifying force. Large ceramic vats or bronze cauldrons, sometimes holding dozens of litres, were set up for communal drinking. Long straws allowed groups to sip together from the same vessel, creating a literal act of shared consumption. Imagine the spectacle. Warriors, farmers, and elders leaning in, faces lit by firelight, drawing the same liquid through carved reeds. In that moment, hierarchy blurred, and intoxication bound them as one. The hall was also a place of storytelling and memory-making. Bards recited genealogies and heroic tales, music echoed against the beams, and dancers stamped rhythms into the floor. The feasting hall wasn't just about calories and alcohol, it was about forging identity. To participate in the ritual of feasting was to declare, "I belong to this community, and this community belongs to me." Even in death, the importance of feasting was remembered. Some halls doubled as sacred sites, and feasting vessels have been found in elite burials. These were not just leftovers, they were deliberate symbols, ensuring that the dead carried the social prestige of the feast into the afterlife. In short, the feasting hall was a crucible of Bronze Age society. Here, brewing became politics, intoxication became ritual, and eating together became the glue that held entire communities in place. To understand Bronze Age feasting, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or rather, the slurred words and staggering bodies. Intoxication wasn't a byproduct of these gatherings. It was the point. Alcohol loosened tongues, dissolved barriers, and created a shared sense of euphoria that could be harnessed for ritual, politics, and social cohesion. For many Bronze Age cultures, intoxication carried sacred meaning. It was more than just getting drunk. Fermentation itself seemed like magic, invisible forces transforming grain and honey into something that made people feel lighter, bolder, even closer to the divine. Drinking was often tied to ritual offerings, with cups raised to gods or ancestors before being shared among the living. In some traditions, alcohol was thought to thin the veil between worlds, allowing participants to commune with spirits or strengthen bonds with the dead. At the same time, intoxication had a clear political function. Leaders and chiefs used alcohol strategically, providing more than enough for everyone to drink deeply. When people were warm, full, and tipsy, they were more receptive to alliances, more likely to accept hierarchy, and less likely to rebel. The feast created a social contract, and intoxication was its seal. To drink the host's beer was to acknowledge their generosity, authority, and rightful place at the centre of the community. But drunkenness also carried risks. Too much drink could lead to violence, foolish boasting, or disastrous decisions. Archaeological sites sometimes reveal weapons alongside feasting debris, a sign that not every celebration ended peacefully. Stories passed down in later oral traditions warn of leaders who overindulged, making poor choices in the haze of drink. The line between sacred intoxication and dangerous excess was always thin. Alcohol also played a role in inclusion and exclusion. At some feasts, the best brews or the first cup went to elites, while others got weaker or watered-down portions. In this way, intoxication was controlled, ensuring that the powerful enjoyed its benefits more than the common folk. Even drunken equality had its limits. In the end, intoxication in the Bronze Age was never just about pleasure. It was about creating a heightened state, spiritual, social, and political, where communities could reinforce their values, leaders could demonstrate their power, and individuals could briefly escape the burdens of everyday survival. To be drunk together was to be bound together, for better or worse. Feasting in the Bronze Age wasn't only about filling stomachs or raising cups. At its core, these gatherings carried a ritual dimension, where food and drink became offerings to forces greater than the community itself. Archaeology has revealed not just bones and jars at feast sites, but also evidence of deliberate deposits. Whole animal remains, broken vessels, and pools of liquid poured into the earth. These were not accidents, they were sacrifices. For many Bronze Age cultures, animals were the most valuable resource a person could own. Cattle provided milk, muscle for ploughing, and prestige. Sheep gave wool and meat. Pigs fattened quickly for feasts. To slaughter one, especially a prized ox, was a costly choice. But in the context of a communal ritual, the act of sacrifice displayed generosity and devotion. The choicest cuts might be burned as offerings to the gods or ancestors, while the rest was shared among the living. The message was clear: prosperity was only possible with divine favour, and that favour had to be renewed through ritual. Alcohol also played a central role in these offerings. Libations, the pouring out of drink, appear again and again in the archaeological record. Bronze Age people would spill beer or mead onto the ground, into rivers, or over fire pits before drinking themselves. To waste precious drink may seem strange to us, but to them it was a symbolic act of sharing with unseen powers. The gods received the first sip, and only after that could humans join in. Feasting halls themselves sometimes became ritualized spaces. Broken cups and jars found deliberately buried under floors or near hearths suggest that vessels were not simply discarded, but killed ceremonially, perhaps marking the end of a feast or honouring ancestors. In burial mounds, feasting gear was placed with the dead, ensuring they would continue to dine and drink in the afterlife. These rituals blurred the line between religion, politics, and community. A feast wasn't complete until the gods had their portion, and in giving, leaders reinforced their own role as mediators between mortals and the divine. The sacrifice of food and drink became a statement. Our community is strong, our gods are honoured, and our future is secured. Thus, the Bronze Age feast was not just a party. It was a sacred drama, with every cup and carcass carrying meaning beyond the meal itself. For all the speculation about Bronze Age brewing and feasting, much of what we know doesn't come from ancient stories or written records. It comes from archaeology, the stubborn clues left behind in soil, stone, and pottery. Every shard of a drinking cup or smear of residue in a jar is a whisper from a celebration thousands of years ago. One of the most important breakthroughs in recent decades has been residue analysis. Using chemical testing, researchers can detect microscopic traces of barley starch, honey sugars, grape tannins, and plant oils clinging to the inside of ancient vessels. These tiny remains prove that people weren't just drinking water or milk. They were fermenting grains, sweetening drinks with honey, and flavouring them with herbs. Some jars even reveal mixtures of ingredients, suggesting that Bronze Age brewers were experimenting with blends, much like modern craft brewers do today. Feasting sites themselves tell another story. Excavations at large settlements and ceremonial centres have uncovered enormous cooking pits, ash layers from great fires, and heaps of animal bones with cut marks showing mass slaughter. These weren't family dinners. They were large-scale events, staged for entire communities, sometimes lasting for days. The discovery of oversized drinking vessels and communal vats confirms that alcohol was brewed and consumed in vast quantities. Even burials provide evidence. In elite graves, archaeologists have found ornate cups, bronze cauldrons, and drinking horns placed alongside the dead. These objects weren't just tools, they were symbols. To be buried with feasting gear was to carry prestige into the afterlife, signalling that the deceased had held power at the banquet table in life. In some cases, residue inside these vessels still reveals traces of mead or beer, offering a chemical snapshot of the last drink they may have held. Perhaps the most evocative finds are broken vessels deliberately deposited in pits or beneath feasting halls. These suggest ritual closing acts, as if each feast needed to be sealed with a symbolic gesture, sacrificing the very tools of intoxication to the gods. Together, these archaeological discoveries allow us to reconstruct not only what Bronze Age people drank, but how they lived, celebrated, and bound themselves together. Every cracked jar and charred bone tells us that feasts were not occasional luxuries. They were central to the rhythm of life, woven into politics, ritual, and identity. When the fires burned low and the last jars were drained, Bronze Age feasts left behind more than just ashes and bones. They left traditions that would echo through centuries of human culture. The legacy of those early brewing experiments and communal banquets still lingers in how we celebrate, how we bond, and even how we understand power. At the most basic level, the Bronze Age feast demonstrated the power of alcohol as social glue. Drinking together wasn't just about pleasure, it created trust, solidarity, and identity. That same idea persists in modern societies, from pub culture to wine at weddings, from ritual toasts to national festivals. What Bronze Age communities discovered is that intoxication, when shared, becomes a force that binds people tighter than any spoken contract. These feasts also laid the groundwork for political theatre. Chieftains who provided rivers of beer and heaps of roasted meat set the template for rulers who would later use public banquets, bread, and wine to secure loyalty. The Roman emperor's triumphal feasts, the Viking mead hall, the medieval banquet, all of these traditions can trace a faint lineage back to Bronze Age chiefs raising cups of mead to their followers. The act of feeding and intoxicating people has always been one of the simplest ways to demonstrate authority. On the religious side, the Bronze Age habit of pouring libations and making food offerings evolved into more structured ritual traditions. Sacrificial banquets to gods, offerings of wine at temples, and sacred feasts tied to seasonal festivals all reflect this enduring idea that food and drink could be shared not just with people, but with the divine. Even the technology of brewing carried forward. Techniques like malting, mashing, and flavouring became more refined over time, but the core principles established in the Bronze Age never disappeared. Every craft brewery today, with its carefully roasted malts and experimental herbs, echoes the creativity of those early brewers who first transformed porridge into beer. In the end, Bronze Age brewing and feasting remind us that civilization wasn't built only on bronze tools, fortified walls, or trade networks. It was also built around the table, where grain and honey became drink, where meat became sacrifice, and where community became something stronger than the sum of its parts. The feast was civilization's heartbeat, and its rhythm still pulses through our celebrations today. The Illyrians were a people shaped by their environment. Stretching across the rugged eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea, from modern-day Albania through Montenegro, Dalmatia, and into the Balkans, their homeland was a mix of jagged mountains, deep river valleys, and countless islands. These were not fertile plains where great empires grew fat on grain. They were hard lands that demanded resilience. And from this landscape emerged a people who turned naturally toward the sea. The Adriatic itself was both a barrier and a highway. Its choppy waters and unpredictable winds could punish the unprepared, but they also offered passage to wealth, adventure, and power. The Illyrians learned early to master this maritime world. Small fishing boats became their training ground, coastal trade their livelihood, and over time they gained a reputation as some of the most daring sailors of antiquity. By the late Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, Greek and Italic sources already spoke of the Illyrians as both a threat and a necessity. Their ships, often light and fast, could dart out from hidden coves, catching traders by surprise. At the same time, those same ships carried valuable goods, copper, livestock, hides, and even slaves, into foreign harbours. This dual image, of seafarers who were at once partners and predators, would define the Illyrians for centuries. Geography gave them their strength. The countless inlets and offshore islands of the Dalmatian coast provided safe harbours, hiding spots, and launching points for raids. Unlike the large, lumbering galleys of the Greeks, Illyrian ships were sleek and manoeuvrable. They didn't fight by ramming and boarding alone. They fought by striking quickly and disappearing, letting the sea itself serve as both battlefield and refuge. To their neighbours, the Illyrians were unsettling. A Greek merchant might sail 1 week in peaceful trade with an Illyrian chieftain, and the next week find his convoy attacked by men flying the same banners. The line between commerce and piracy was thin, and the Illyrians walked it confidently. Their reputation as masters of the Adriatic was not just about dominance on the waves, it was about unpredictability. They were a people the sea had forged into merchants, warriors, and raiders, all in one. And as history would show, their influence would ripple far beyond their rocky coastline, shaping the naval traditions of the Mediterranean itself. The Illyrians earned their fame and infamy by sailing the delicate line between commerce and piracy. To understand them, you must picture the Adriatic not as a peaceful waterway, but as a contested frontier where merchants, colonists, and raiders constantly rubbed shoulders. The Illyrians thrived in this uncertain world, playing both sides of the coin depending on the season, the opportunity, and the mood of their chieftains. As merchants, they were indispensable. The eastern Adriatic offered natural resources that were in high demand: metals from inland mines, livestock from mountain pastures, hides, timber, and amber carried south from trade routes stretching all the way to the Baltic. Illyrian ships ferried these goods to Greek colonies along the Adriatic and to Italic tribes across the water. For the Greeks, who relied heavily on imported materials, Illyrian trade networks were essential. Amphorae and Greek pottery found in Illyrian settlements prove that commerce flowed both ways, with wine, olive oil, and luxury goods reaching the rocky Adriatic shores. Yet the Illyrians' identity as raiders was just as strong. The very same ships that carried goods into foreign harbours could just as easily be used to plunder them. Illyrian seafarers became notorious for swooping down on passing convoys, stripping them of cargo, and vanishing into the labyrinth of islands that dotted their coast. To Mediterranean traders, this unpredictability was maddening. One day an Illyrian was a partner, the next a predator. For the Illyrians themselves, there was no contradiction. Trade and piracy were simply two sides of the same maritime lifestyle. A successful raid might enrich a chieftain as much as a trade deal, and both secured his reputation as a leader, capable of providing wealth and spoils. In fact, piracy often fueled commerce. Plundered goods could be sold in distant ports, blending neatly into legitimate markets. This dual role gave the Illyrians both power and danger. Their neighbours resented the constant threat of raids, but could not afford to cut ties completely. Greek colonies needed Illyrian trade. Italic cities coveted their resources. Thus, the Illyrians became both feared and tolerated, living in the space between ally and enemy. In this balance of merchant and pirate, the Illyrians carved out their identity. They were not bound by the rules of empires or city-states. Instead, they made the Adriatic their own, a place where wealth could be seized by coin or by blade, and where their reputation as unpredictable seafarers grew ever stronger. If the Illyrians earned their fame on the sea, it was the Liburna that carried their reputation across the waves. This sleek vessel, named after the Liburni tribe of northern Illyria, was unlike the bulky merchant ships or the massive galleys of the Mediterranean powers. Where others relied on sheer size or weight, the Illyrians prized speed, maneuverability, and surprise, and the Liburna delivered all three. The design was deceptively simple. The Liburna was long and narrow, with a shallow draft that allowed it to skim across waters where larger ships would struggle. It could slip through narrow channels, hug coastlines, and dart into hidden inlets where pursuers dared not follow. Equipped with one or two banks of oars manned by skilled Illyrian rowers, it could pivot quickly in combat or outrun heavier adversaries. A single square sail could be raised for longer voyages, but in battle, the oars gave it its deadly edge. Unlike the cumbersome Greek trireme, which demanded large crews and open seas to operate effectively, the Liburna thrived in the broken geography of the Adriatic. It was perfectly suited for hit-and-run tactics, raiding a merchant convoy, harassing coastal settlements, or vanishing into an island-studded horizon before enemies could respond. Raiders could strike at dawn and be gone by noon, leaving baffled victims with little chance of retaliation. The Liburna wasn't just a pirate's craft, it was also a merchant's lifeline. Its swiftness ensured safe passage for traders, while its agility allowed cargo to reach remote coastal communities. In this way, the ship embodied the duality of the Illyrian people themselves, capable of commerce and plunder, depending on who commanded it. Its reputation became so formidable that even Rome took notice. During their long conflicts with the Illyrians, Roman commanders saw firsthand how effective the Liburna was against larger fleets. Far from dismissing it as a barbarian craft, they adopted and refined it, eventually making the Liburna a staple of the Roman navy. In fact, by the time of Augustus, fleets of Roman Liburni patrolled the Mediterranean, guarding imperial trade routes and suppressing pirates. An ironic twist, since the ship itself had once been the pirate's weapon of choice. The Liburna, then, was more than wood and oars. It was a statement that cunning and adaptability could outmatch brute force. It carried Illyrian raiders into legend and left a legacy that shaped naval warfare for centuries. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, The Illyrians had developed a reputation that struck fear across the Adriatic. They were the pirates of the sea. While many Illyrian tribes traded peacefully with neighbours, others turned piracy into an organised enterprise. From their fortified coastal towns and island strongholds, Illyrian fleets launched raids that terrorised merchants, colonists, and rival states alike. The geography of their homeland gave them an edge. With its countless islands, jagged coves and treacherous shallows, the eastern Adriatic was a natural hideout for raiders. Illyrian captains knew every channel and current, every rock and sandbank. A foreign ship that wandered too close could be ambushed, its cargo stripped, and its crew either ransomed or enslaved. For the Illyrians, piracy wasn't random banditry. It was a calculated system of wealth and power. Greek merchants were frequent victims. Records tell of Illyrian raids against Aegean traders carrying wine, oil, and luxury goods. The Illyrians didn't just seize goods, they disrupted entire trade networks, forcing cities like Athens and Corinth to rethink their maritime strategies. Even Italic traders, venturing across the Adriatic, were not safe. For many Mediterranean communities, the very word Illyrian became synonymous with piracy. What made these raids especially alarming was their scale and boldness. Illyrian fleets didn't just harass small traders, they sometimes attacked convoys, coastal colonies, and even warships. Under powerful rulers like Queen Teuta in the 3rd century BCE, piracy became state policy. Teuta famously authorized her captains to plunder at will, claiming it was a long-standing Illyrian custom. For her, piracy wasn't crime. It was tradition, and a legitimate expression of Illyrian freedom at sea. This attitude brought them into direct conflict with rising powers, especially Rome. Roman traders increasingly suffered at Illyrian hands, and Rome could not tolerate the threat to its commerce. Complaints from Greek allies only fueled the fire, painting the Illyrians as lawless marauders who needed to be subdued. The stage was set for confrontation, and Rome, unlike Greek city-states, had the manpower and resolve to crush piracy at its source. Thus, the Illyrians' dominance of the Adriatic, built on the sharp prows of their Liburni and the ferocity of their raids, became both their greatest strength and their eventual undoing. By daring to prey on the wrong merchants, they had awakened a power far greater than themselves. Few figures capture the spirit of Illyrian seafaring as vividly as Queen Teuta. In the early 3rd century BCE, she ruled as regent over the Ardeaei, one of the most powerful Illyrian tribes. Her reign coincided with the peak of Illyrian naval power and the height of their piracy. For Rome and its allies, Teuta became the very embodiment of the Adriatic threat. According to ancient sources, Teuta actively encouraged raiding. She reportedly told her captains to take what they pleased, arguing that piracy was not a crime, but a time-honoured Illyrian tradition. Under her authority, Illyrian fleets expanded their operations deeper into the Adriatic and even into the Ionian Sea. Greek traders were harassed, Italic merchants attacked, and Roman envoys soon lodged formal complaints. Rome, still growing in power after its wars with Carthage, could not ignore such provocations. To the Senate, piracy threatened not only trade, but also Rome's reputation as the protector of allies. When Roman envoys were dispatched to negotiate with Teuta, she allegedly dismissed their demands outright. Worse, one of the envoys was murdered on his return journey, an act that Rome interpreted as a direct insult. The response was swift. In 229 BCE, Rome launched the First Illyrian War, sending a fleet across the Adriatic. For the Illyrians, accustomed to preying on merchants and outmaneuvering Greek patrols, the scale of Rome's naval power came as a shock. Roman galleys blockaded ports, stormed coastal strongholds, and dismantled the very pirate bases that had long been untouchable. Teuta resisted fiercely, but the tide turned quickly. One by one, Illyrian allies abandoned her, and Roman pressure forced her into submission. By 227 BCE, Teuta was compelled to accept harsh terms. She relinquished most of her fleet, withdrew from southern Illyria, and acknowledged Roman authority over key Adriatic waters. Though she retained a small territory, her reign was effectively broken, yet Teuto's defiance left a lasting impression. Roman writers painted her as a dangerous pirate queen, both admired for her boldness and condemned for her defiance of Rome's order. For the Illyrians, she symbolized independence, a ruler who dared to stand against the most formidable power of her age. But Rome had learned something crucial. Controlling the Adriatic meant controlling Illyria, and this lesson would shape not just Roman policy, but the very future of Mediterranean naval warfare. The Illyrians may have lost their independence to Rome, but their ships, especially the Liburna, left an indelible mark on history. What had once been the scourge of Roman merchants soon became the backbone of Rome's own naval strategy. In a twist of irony, the very vessel that had terrorized Roman trade would go on to secure Roman dominance over the seas. The Romans were nothing if not pragmatic. When they encountered a superior technology, they didn't dismiss it, they absorbed it. During the First and Second Illyrian Wars, Roman commanders witnessed firsthand how agile Illyrian ships outmaneuvered heavier galleys. The trireme, with its 3 banks of oars and large crew, had been the standard warship across the Mediterranean for centuries. But in the narrow straits and island-studded waters of the Adriatic, it was clumsy compared to the Liburna. By adopting the design, Rome gave itself a new advantage. The Roman Liburna was built on the Illyrian model, long, narrow, shallow-drafted, and light. Typically manned by 2 banks of oars, it required fewer crewmen than a trireme, but could travel faster and with greater endurance. In battle, Liburnae were excellent for reconnaissance, flanking manoeuvres, and quick raids. Against pirates, many of whom still clung to Illyrian tactics, they were unmatched. The true test of the Liburna came later, during Rome's great civil wars. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's fleet, which included many Liburni, outmaneuvered the massive quinqueremes of Antony and Cleopatra. The smaller ships, with their speed and agility, swarmed the heavier vessels, helping Octavian secure his victory and ultimately paving the way for the Roman Empire. From then on, the Liburna became a staple of the Roman navy. It was not only a warship, but also a patrol vessel, perfect for policing the empire's vast coastline and guarding trade routes. Fleets of Liburni patrolled the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and even river systems like the Danube and the Rhine. The ship that had once symbolized Illyrian piracy was now the emblem of Roman order. This adoption highlights the paradox of the Illyrians' legacy. Though Rome crushed their independence, it immortalized their ingenuity. Every time a Roman Liburna sailed, it carried with it the ghost of Illyrian craftsmanship, proof that even in defeat, the Illyrians had shaped the future of naval warfare. To understand the Illyrians, one must see how deeply their culture was tied to the sea. For them, sailing was not simply a profession, it was a way of life that blurred the boundaries between merchant, warrior, and pirate. Along the Adriatic's rocky coastlines and in its island harbours, Illyrian identity was forged on the water. Daily life revolved around boats. Small fishing craft fed villages, while larger vessels like the Liburna allowed for both trade and raiding. A ship could carry hides, amber, and livestock across the sea one month and return laden with stolen amphorae of wine the next. For Illyrian chieftains, the sea was both a marketplace and a battlefield, and their crews shifted roles as easily as raising or lowering a sail. This dual existence shaped Illyrian society. Wealth from raids and trade enriched local elites, who displayed their status with imported goods from Greece and Italy, pottery, jewellery, and weapons that testified to their reach. Yet prestige was not measured by commerce alone. A leader's reputation also depended on his ability to raid, to bring back spoils, and to command loyalty at sea. In this way, piracy became not a shameful crime, but a cultural tradition, bound up with ideas of freedom, honour, and strength. Religion, too, reflected this maritime identity. Illyrian tribes worshipped deities tied to the natural world, mountains, rivers, storms, and the sea itself. To sail was to place oneself at the mercy of divine forces, and rituals often accompanied voyages. Libations might be poured before a raid, or sacrifices offered after a successful return. The sea was not only a resource, but a sacred space, where commerce, conflict, and faith intertwined. At the village level, seafaring also wove together communities. Rowing a Liburna required teamwork, and the bonds formed between oarsmen created loyalty that extended beyond kinship ties. Shared risks at sea built trust and unity, reinforcing the collective identity of Illyrian crews. These bonds, tested in the spray of waves and the clash of boarding battles, carried back into their settlements on land. In the end, Illyrian culture cannot be divided neatly into pirate or merchant, trader or warrior. They were all of these at once, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the Adriatic. The sea provided their livelihood, their legends, and their legacy, a culture defined by the shifting line between trade and war. The Adriatic was never an empty sea. On its western shores rose the Italic tribes and later, Rome. To the south and east, Greek colonies dotted the coasts. For the Illyrians, seafaring meant constant interaction with these neighbours, sometimes friendly, often hostile, and always shaping their reputation. The Greeks were among the first to record the Illyrians in detail. By the early Iron Age, Greek traders and colonists had pushed northward, establishing settlements along the Adriatic. Corinthian and Athenian merchants carried wine, pottery and luxury goods to exchange for Illyrian livestock, metals and slaves. Archaeological finds of Greek amphorae and fine ceramics in Illyrian settlements testify to thriving commerce. Yet the same records are filled with complaints of raids, thefts, and sudden Illyrian ambushes. To the Greeks, Illyrians were both partners in trade and predators lurking beyond the horizon. These encounters shaped Greek attitudes. In plays and histories, the Illyrians were often portrayed as fierce, uncivilized, and unpredictable. Yet even in disdain, there was respect, especially for their naval skills. Greek ships rarely penetrated deep into Illyrian waters, knowing the dangers of sudden raids in the labyrinth of islands and coves that only Illyrians truly mastered. Contact with Italic peoples was no less complex. Across the sea, Etruscans and later Romans coveted the resources of Illyria. Trade networks crisscrossed the Adriatic, moving amber from northern Europe, tin and copper from inland mines, and Illyrian timber prized for shipbuilding. At the same time, Italic merchants and settlers bore the brunt of Illyrian piracy. What the Greeks endured as nuisance raids, the Romans saw as intolerable threats to their growing dominance. Illyrian interactions were not confined to simple plunder or commerce. Marriages between elites, diplomatic agreements, and alliances in times of war show that Illyrians could be pragmatic. They fought as mercenaries in foreign wars, and their ships occasionally served as hired escorts for traders willing to pay. The Illyrian reputation as pirates was deserved, but it was never their whole story. Still, the constant friction with neighbours meant that Illyrians were rarely left alone. Their very success at sea drew both wealth and enemies. Every amphora traded or ship plundered deepened the paradox of Illyrian life, admired for their maritime power, condemned for their defiance of Mediterranean order. The Adriatic, then, was not just their highway, but their battleground, the place where Illyrians defined themselves against Greeks, Italians, and ultimately Rome. Though Rome eventually subdued them, the Illyrians left a mark on the Mediterranean that cannot be erased. Their reputation as fearless sailors, cunning raiders, and shrewd traders made them both feared and respected across the ancient world. More importantly, their maritime innovations, especially the Liburna, lived on long after their political independence was gone. The Romans, ever practical, adopted what had once terrified them. By making the Liburna a core element of their naval fleets, they spread Illyrian design across the empire. Roman Liburnae patrolled the Adriatic, hunted pirates in the Aegean, and escorted imperial convoys across the Mediterranean. In many ways, Rome's ability to dominate the seas owed a debt to the very people they had crushed. Every Roman patrol boat that skimmed the water's surface was, in essence, a descendant of Illyrian ingenuity. Culturally, the Illyrians remind us that the line between merchant and pirate was never fixed in the ancient world. Their society thrived on adaptability. One day a trader exchanging amber for wine, the next a raider seizing amphorae by force. To them, there was no contradiction. The sea was opportunity, and those who commanded it could choose how to wield that power. This duality gave them resilience, but it also drew the wrath of more rigid, expansionist powers like Rome. Their story also highlights the role of geography in shaping identity. The jagged Adriatic coast, riddled with islands and coves, forged a people who knew the water intimately and used it to their advantage. Unlike the great land empires that relied on armies and farmland, the Illyrians built their power on the waves, fragile, fluid, but capable of striking far beyond their shores. Even their defeat carries weight in history. By challenging Rome at sea, they forced the Republic to invest in naval supremacy, setting the stage for centuries of Roman control of the Mediterranean. The Illyrians, in this sense, helped accelerate Rome's transformation into a true maritime power. Today, the memory of the Illyrians lingers in the Adriatic's coastal towns, in the legends of pirate queens like Teuta, and in the outlines of ships once feared and later revered. They may not have built empires of stone, but they carved their legacy into the waters of the Adriatic, proving that a small people, armed with speed, daring, and knowledge of the sea, could shape the destiny of nations.